This is Lesson 15.4, the development of Russia and the Ottoman Empire. What were the distinctive features of Russian and Ottoman absolutism? And this is our buddy right here, Peter the Great. Well, what are our College Board topics? We've got 3.6, balance of power. Explain how European states attempted to establish and maintain a balance of power on the continent throughout the period from 1648 from 1815, and that's period 2 for our course. We also have this aspect of balance of power. After 1648, dynastic and state interests, along with Europe's expanding colonial empires, influenced the diplomacy of European states and frequently led to war. After the Austrian defeat of the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna, the Ottomans ceased their westward expansion. Explain how advances in technology contributed to a developing balance of power on the continent throughout the period from 1648 to 1815. Advances in military technology led to new forms of warfare, including greater reliance on infantry, firearms, mobile cannon, and more elaborate fortifications, all financed by heavier taxation and requiring a larger bureaucracy. Sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? New military techniques and institutions, i.e. the military revolution, tipped the balance of power towards states able to marshal sufficient resources for the new military environment. We also have College Board topic 3.7, absolutist approaches to power. Explain how absolutist forms of rule affected social and political development from, once again, 1648 to 1815. Peter the Great westernized the Russian state and society, transforming political, religious, and cultural institutions. Catherine the Great continued this process. Place Russia, time frame 1680s to 1725. And we also have another place, the Ottoman Empire, time frame 1680s to 1725. Key people of the development of Russia and the Ottoman Empire: Peter the Great, Hiram, Ivan IV, also known as you can see, Ivan the Terrible. And we have Suleiman the Magnificent, also known as Suleiman the Lawgiver. Key concepts of the development of Russia and the Ottoman Empire: serfdom, the Millet concept, commonly known as the Millet System, the Cossacks, the Boyars, and the Janissary Corps. Let's begin with Russia. There were quite a few similarities between the way the Eastern European monarchs consolidated power and the way that Russian monarchs consolidated power. Keep in mind that as far as our textbook is concerned, Eastern Europe is countries like Prussia, the Austrian Empire, and Poland, whereas Russia is Russia. All these greatly expanded their borders, all forged a consensus between themselves and their high-ranking nobles at the expense of the serfs and urban classes, all greatly increased their bureaucracies, and all greatly increased their militaries. However, there were also some significant differences between Eastern Europe and Russia. There were geographical differences. Russia straddled Europe and Asia. Russia was greatly influenced by the Mongols, their former overlords, and Russia was greatly influenced by the old Byzantine Empire. There were also religious differences between Eastern Europe and Russia. Russia was Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Europe was Catholic and Protestant. There were economic and social differences between Eastern Europe and Russia. While Eastern Europe definitely had serfdom, Russian elites took serfdom to a whole new level. One result of that was a group of people called the Cossacks. Russia even had state serfdom, serfs working government land. But the most significant differences were the technological and cultural differences. Russia was culturally isolated from the rest of Europe. Russia was technologically way behind the rest of Europe. And Russian monarchs embarked upon significant campaigns to modernize and westernize. Here are some images of serfdom. Here we have a picture. It's kind of a bookend type of situation. We have the first actual Tsar, Ivan IV, And we have the last Tsar, Nicholas II. Russia had greatly expanded its borders over time for centuries. This really began when Moscow was still under Mongol rule. In the year 1480, Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great, declared independence from the Mongols. He married a relative of the last Byzantine emperor, and Ivan III had help from the Boyars, those high nobles, in establishing his kingdom's new independence. Ivan IV, otherwise known as Ivan the Terrible, continued this Russian expansion. And in 1547, Ivan IV took on the title Tsar, Russian for Caesar. He began conquering former territories of the declining Mongol kingdoms in Asia. Russia eventually expanded all the way to the Pacific by the year 1700. Peter the Great, who reigned from 1682 to 1725. Peter the Great expanded Russia's borders in order to obtain a warm water port. He went to war against the Ottoman Empire for a port in the city of Azov in the Black Sea. Peter failed to gain a permanent port there. In 1700, Peter went to war against Sweden to control Estonia and Latvia on the Baltic Sea. He built St. Petersburg, a warm water port on the Baltic Sea. Peter the Great's highest ambition was the modernization and westernization of Russia. In the year 1697, Peter the Great went on a tour of Western European capitals. He was fascinated by foreign technology. He took 250 Russian officials along, and that tour lasted 18 months. Peter the Great brought back over 100 foreign experts to Russia for two purposes. One, helping to modernize Russia's navy, and two, improving Russia's infrastructure. Peter the Great built the city of St. Petersburg. He made it his new capital. The design reflected modern urban planning. It sat on the Baltic as a warm water port, and it was to be Peter's so-called window to the West. Peter encouraged the spread of Western culture to Russia. Peter knew that Russia's long cultural isolation from the rest of Europe made Russians look primitive and ignorant. He required nobles to shave their beards like Westerners did. Sometimes he even cut their beards off himself. He also required them to wear Western-style clothes, no more of those old-fashioned long coats. Peter the Great hosted aristocratic parties in which he would force men and women to dance together. The Russian culture imposed a lot of social separation between men and women, which he was hoping to change. Peter the Great was trying to update that aspect of the culture. Peter the Great strengthened both Russia's military and Russia's bureaucracy. The Great Northern War against Sweden from 1700 to 1721 was against a well-trained professional Swedish army. One could argue that Peter's campaign to modernize would not have happened without competition against Sweden. The war began with Russian defeats, especially the Battle of Narva in 1700. But Peter resolved to modernize the army and the bureaucracy, and he finally defeated the Swedes in the Battle of Poltava in 1709. Peter's revenge upon Sweden for early defeats came at great cost to both the nobles and the peasants of Russia. All of Russia's nobles, the Boyars, had to serve in either the military or in the civil service for life. Peter created schools and universities, and every nobleman was required to spend 5 years there. Peter established a military civilian bureaucracy, which was a meritocracy. And this was also bad news for Peter's boyar class. This meant that everyone started out at the bottom and advanced through hard work and ability. Merit. People of humble origins were now able to compete with nobles for government advancement based on hard work and abilities as opposed to just having a noble title to their names. Peter's efforts were especially tough on Russian peasants. Over 200,000 peasant soldiers were drafted into the military for life. He gradually tripled taxes on the peasants to fund the army. Serfs were forced to work in mines and factories that supplied the army. Peter the Great also created regiments of Cossacks and mercenaries to bolster his forces. Peter the Great also westernized the Russian Church, an Eastern Orthodox church. He fundamentally transformed the Eastern Orthodox Church. He took governance away from the patriarch or the metropolitan, another high church office. Instead, he put it under the control of a committee called the Most Holy Governing Synod, and they consisted of a mixture of bishops and lay bureaucrats, hand-picked by Peter himself. Peter the Great caused the Ukrainization of the Russian Church. In other words, he brought in a lot of clergy from Ukraine and Belarus who had more Western-style theological training. And by the mid-1700s, the majority of Russian churches were headed by clergy from Ukraine. Many suspected that Peter had Protestant leanings, although he never renounced Eastern Orthodoxy. In spite of all of Peter the Great's efforts to modernize and westernize Russia, there were three institutions that remained intact in Russia during this time. First, Russia's identification with the Eastern Orthodox Church didn't change. Moscow was considered the center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The church eventually followed Russian expansion all over the rest of Asia. And in 1649, laws were passed that said that non-Russian elites had to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. The Romanov dynasty also didn't change. It lasted for 300 years. The Romanov family had a feeling of being special and being destined for greatness because of their position as Russian rulers and because of Russia's Eastern Orthodoxy. Orthodox churchmen referred to Russia as Holy Russia. Russia was considered the Third Rome. And this feeling began in 1613 with Michael I, the very first Romanov Tsar, and lasted until 1917, over 300 years. The Romanov Tsars consistently pursued state building and expansion from 1650 to 1725. But the most significant institution that remained intact was serfdom. Serfs did not benefit from Russia's progress, but instead continued to suffer. 25,000 to 40,000 serfs were forced to build the great modern city of St. Petersburg without pay every summer. Serfs were compelled to work in factories and mines for the military, and 200,000 peasants were conscripted into the modern army for life, and taxes on the peasants tripled under Peter's reign. The Ottoman Empire. Here's a map of the Ottoman Empire in 1683 at the height of its power. There were several similarities between the goals of Ottoman absolutism and the absolutism of the West. Both greatly expanded their borders, both had an absolute ruler, both had large militaries and large bureaucracies. Both governments were absolute monarchies. The King of France, Louis XIV, was the quintessential absolute monarch, and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was also an absolute monarch. He owned all of the agricultural land in the empire, and he was served by an army and a bureaucracy of trained slaves. Like France, the Ottomans greatly expanded their borders. They took the largest city in Europe, Constantinople, in 1453 and made it their capital. They also invaded the Balkans. They conquered half of Hungary. They conquered many other Islamic kingdoms, and they turned the Mediterranean into a Turkish lake. Both absolutist governments had large bureaucracies and militaries, and this made Ottoman expansion possible. The Sultan had the highly formidable military corps, the Janissaries, also known as the Janissary Corps. And they were originally composed of non-Muslim children taken from their families and trained and indoctrinated from childhood. But by 1683, the use of indoctrinated slave children was no longer necessary. The Janissaries were so successful that voluntary recruitment supplied all the numbers they needed. There were also some significant differences between the way the Ottoman Empire was run and the way that other European absolutists ran their governments. Number one, the Ottoman Empire had virtually no high noble class, no landed hereditary nobility. Instead, the Sultan personally owned all the agricultural land, and the peasants paid taxes for the use of that land directly to the Sultan. The Ottoman Empire had, like we said, a non-Muslim slave corps, and these slaves ran the bureaucracy and served in the military. Islamic law forbade the use of fellow Muslims as slaves, so purchasing agents bought non-Muslim slaves on the borders of their territory, and they taxed their Christian subjects for 1,000 to 3,000 male children per year. These were raised as Muslims, they were trained for fighting and for administration, and they had opportunities for wealth and power. The Sultan's daughters were married to high-ranking slaves, and many of these were assigned to the Janissary Corps. The millet concept is often inaccurately called the Millet System. The way it worked was this. Under the Ottoman Empire, your religious community, whether it was Catholic or Orthodox or Jewish, etc., that was your millet, and you were legally bound to your religious community, not to your ethnicity. This millet concept allowed the various non-Muslim minorities in the Ottoman Empire to run themselves with a great deal of legal autonomy. Religious autonomy for these minorities, that was another matter. Each millet had its own court systems, leaders, laws, and taxes. Islamic law took precedence in any legal issue that involved a Muslim. All that was required of these millets was loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. Non-Abrahamic traditions, in other words, polytheistic traditions, were not recognized as millets. The millet concept allowed these religious minorities to run their own internal affairs with relatively little interference from the Islamic Ottoman government. And this reduced friction between religious minorities and the state. But the greatest difference between Ottoman absolutism and absolutism in the rest of Europe was the succession of the Sultan. The Sultan married women of the highest nobility, but he did not want the wife's family to gain too much influence, so sultans had no children by their wives. For children, sultans kept concubines of lower rank, and sultans procreated only through their concubines, and each concubine could only have one male heir. When the male son was ready, he was put in charge of an Ottoman province, and the concubine mother would go with him. And this ensured loyalty and stability for the empire, and it also prevented civil wars. Suleiman the Magnificent. He ruled from 1520 to 1566, and Suleiman messed with the succession system. He married his concubine, whose name was Hurrem, and he had 5 children with her. Her son, Selim II, inherited the throne, and Hurrem became very powerful and influential. The Ottoman Empire began to decline after the death of Suleiman. The Ottoman Empire experienced numerous revolts. There was also a loss of international trade due to Portuguese and Dutch exploration, as we've already seen. And this resulted in higher prices throughout the empire. And there was also a shrinking population. The military failed to stay modern. It failed to adopt new technologies, and it failed to adopt new training methods. The Ottomans eventually had to cede Hungary and Transylvania to the Austrian Habsburgs. And finally, the Ottomans failed twice to capture the Habsburg capital of Vienna, the second time being in 1683 at the height of its power.